with Beyhan Karahan from New York. Actually, she will also be talking about the ecology of the region, history of urbanism, and reflections of ecological sensitivity in architecture. Professor Beyhan Karahan, AIA lead, is a teacher and a practicing architect in New York over the last 3 decades. She is the coordinator of the 4th-year design studios at the New York Institute of Technology, focused on integration of sustainable architecture and technology and community design. Her practice in New York metropolitan region also focuses on working with macro and micro effects of climate and context of buildings. Beyhan Hocam, we are so happy having you with Zuhal Ulusoy's kind suggestion. Welcome again. The presentation will be in English, but the Q&A session, question and answers, are open to both Turkish and English. I think we talk like that. So please begin your presentation. Welcome again.
Thank you very much. Hoş geldiniz. I will start sharing my screen. So I just want to verify that you're able to see my screen. Are you?
Yes.
Very good. Okay. The two images that you see in front of the screen have actually been possible through the most current technology. I am grateful to Eric Sanderson, who wrote the marvelous book Manhattan about the ecological history of Manhattan. And this map on the left, this rendering on the left, was produced through georeferencing, which is a geographic information system that is the most up-to-date thing we use today in the design of cities. And on the right, of course, is the New York City. I think the photograph is approximately 9 months old, so it's quite current. I'll start with my favorite people. I have been teaching history and interior of urban design. One of my favorite historians is Anthony Edmund James Morris. In 1972, he wrote the book called The Form of Cities, when it was politically correct to just talk about the form of cities. But what I admire about his work is his astute observations about the ecology, economy, and its convenience. So he shows where in his own hand-drawn drawing, shows the location of the equator and the foundations of current civilizations, early civilizations from the lower Mesopotamia, the Nile Valley, the Indus, and the Yellow River settlements, as well as the Mesoamerica in Peru. But what I also like about his attitude is that he puts certain areas where he thinks there should be civilizations with question marks. I like his open mind very much, because I think it is probably true that if one digs deeper, one can probably find other civilizations that we don't even know about. The other seminal text that we use that I try to use in all my seminars and my urban design studios are the two masters. Ian Maharg, the Scottish master, has created these diagrams that you see on the left, which not only looks at the topography, but all the other aspects of topography that would create a successful urban settlement. So he starts with this susceptibility to erosion, to soil foundation, bedrock foundation, soil drainage, surface drainage, soils, and then physiographic obstructions. So these are the types of diagrams that Ian Maharg made in '68. And then over here, you can see Fred Steiner's diagram from 2008. We are lucky to still have Fred with us. He is the dean of the Pennsylvania School of Architecture. And this diagram is not as interesting as Ian Maharg's, but it's very full of information. He looks at our environment from all these layers, the abiotic layer that starts with macro and microclimate, bedrock geology, surface elevation slope, and then it goes to soils, hydrology, and then vegetation, fishes, birds, reptiles, and mammals, and all the way up to human beings, and then human history, land uses, demographic, community economics, and community needs. I mean, we try to open up the minds of our students to all these different layers of knowledge before we think about redesigning cities or making interventions into existing cities. So to me, these two diagrams are very important to start off with. So let's go to New York. So we're looking at the topography of the New York State, and the location of our city, of course, is just where the Long Island reaches the coast. And you can see the wealth of the region all the way starting from the Atlantic Ocean, going to the Finger Lakes and the estuary of the Hudson River and the joining rivers made the area to be very convenient for people to settle. If we go to the understanding of what's underneath, we didn't know too much about this until 1840s. The Swiss scientist Louis Agassiz offered an explanation of the glaciers coming down and the geological cross-section of Manhattan. So in the bottom of this diagram here, the cross-section through Midtown shows that we have Precambrian Manhattan schist. And the schist is a very good piece of stone, solid and oily. And it allows, since it's so strong, it allows us to build densely our magnificent skyscrapers. And also is very stable for tunneling and creating a very sophisticated set of systems. So on the left, you probably have the most earliest map done in 1969. And the Manatus map shows the settlements of the Indians, and it shows the windmills that they had, and also I guess the way that the topology and the geography was conceived by the people. But on the right, there is a very important diagram which shows that from the lower tip of the Manhattan all the way to the top, there was an Indian trail. And this Indian trail, which originated at the bottom of the map, is now what we call Broadway, which is still a major street. And Broadway connects all the way from the southern tip of Manhattan up to our capital, Albany, which is several hundred miles away. So, and the reason that Broadway was used by the Indians were because it was the highest terrain. It allowed the marshlands and the rocks to be avoided. I thought when I made this proposal for this lecture that I was going to talk a lot about the Dutch and the English, but it turns out there is so much for us to talk about. So the history of the Dutch and the English is going to be a little brief. Dutch was in New York in 1624, and then English came in 1664. And but in terms of urbanization, I'm going to avoid, because each of these are very long topics. Each of these civilizations, the Dutch and the English invaders, actually were concerned about east-west connections. In fact, the British brought a wall where we have Wall Street downtown in Manhattan, and the collected pond was the major source of fresh water in lower Manhattan, but it was so overused by the population that it eventually got polluted. And then it was discovered that it was as deep as the height of the Empire State Building, hundreds of feet deep. So the British created a canal to drain the collect pond to the east and west. So that gave us our current Canal Street, eventually became a street. So, but the one on the right by the 1782-83 mark by the British cartographers is still one of the most accurate maps. British were, in fact, at the time, probably the most advanced cartographers in the world. This set of drawings, not the nicest among the whole set, but it actually has a lot to tell us about today. On the left, you see all the groundwaters And then in the middle is the topography. But the map next to it, the fuzzy map, is actually the most incredible because currently what we recognize as Manhattan has been subject to a lot of cut and fill. All the areas, the deepest ones, the darkest black ones, are all the way down to 80 feet of fill around the perimeter of Manhattan in certain places where valleys existed. And the reddish part, as it goes from the pink to the brown, are the mountains that they level. They excavated mountains to make the terrain more flat so that it's more navigable for walking and for cars, etc. So Manhattan was actually highly manicured, as we understand now, in terms of its natural topography. And on the right, you see the Lodovico map, 1889. This is a map that we still use when we're trying to determine an address, whether it has groundwater or not below it. Quick jump. Harry Conter, when he came to New York, he said if a European came over here and found that New York was beautiful, in the same way as the European cities he knew, he would be very much disappointed. And this is so true because New York's population doubled and then quadrupled, and the lower Manhattan, where you see in the darker shaded grid on the right map, became so congested that there was a need to expand and to expand in a grand way. The map on the right shows Central Park in the middle, so it's later than this map, obviously, but it also shows a comparison between the scale of Manhattan and its planning versus Paris up north, up on the top. So it's a much grander endeavor and clearly required large amount of investment. On the lower left-hand side, you see this young gentleman, John Randall. He was 20 years old when he was hired by the New York City Planning Commission. He was working under the Chief Surveyor Chief Surveyor Simeon DeWitt and the Governor Morris. But he was the one actually who invented the grid of Manhattan. On the left, you see examples of grids that they examined at the time, the typical blocks in Portland, the Savannah cellular units, which are much more generous with more greenery, and the New York blocks. But what's interesting, of course, for us Turks is that the original grids that we have in our country, the Greek grid in Miletus and Priene, precede all these things. And that the grid's layout of the Portland is pretty similar to the grid that's in Miletus. The other thing that's very important, I think, in terms of understanding urbanism in New York City is the challenge that these people were facing. The thin lines show the grid lines, and underneath it is the individual properties in farms. So it was so complex that actually poor Mr. Randall, in those days, I guess young people matured so soon. He was only in his 20s, but over the time that he became in his 30s, he was so, he encountered so much resistance. He was shot by the property owners. He was imprisoned by the police just because he was trying to lay out the grid that the city commission actually approved by then. So it was a great challenge to actually implement the New York City grid. And they succeeded eventually. This map of 1902 is from the Encyclopedia Britannica. What's interesting about it is that obviously the grid is in place. A great deal of settlement already took place in 1902 in Brooklyn and Queens and on the New Jersey side, a little bit in Staten Island. But what's also interesting about 1902 map is that all the wonderful wetlands of the Jamaica Bay and the Long Island Sound were still pretty active, purifying our waters and giving shelter to indigenous plants and animals. So let's talk about what we're dealing with today, right? China is the biggest trading partner in our port. And after that comes Italy, Germany, and Brazil. And in New York, port serves so many ports around the world. So it's a very major hub of global trade. But I think what's specific here is important because the New York Harbor remains the city's largest, greatest asset, and it covers 650 miles of shore. But actually, because of the silt deposits from Hackensack and Passaic rivers and the Hudson River, its depth is only 18 to 20 feet. As a result, the harbor traffic must stick carefully to predetermined and well-maintained navigation channels. After what's happened this week with Suez Canal, it seemed like it was relevant information to share with you. The water systems. New York City is served by three major systems. The South Delaware was added after the city population exploded again, but before it was the Catskills and the Karahan that supplied the main source of water to the city. And these two maps on the right and left shows the extent and the position of the tunnels that connect into the reservoirs and down into the city. But also, once again, like the Randall's Challenge, these estuaries were established and protected by a tremendous amount of financial input, and dams were created, and the numerous towns and rivers were flooded to make this incredible estuary available for New York to get their fresh water. The New York tunnels, number 1 and 2, were constructed early in the 20th century. And then nearly half of New York City's clean water consumption comes from tunnels 1 and 2. And recently, the tunnel 3 started construction. And even though it was 35 years ago, it's still ongoing because it's a very major undertaking. And I wanted to show you just the view of one of the tunnel number 3 Bronx shaft. And you can see the spatial complexity and monumentality of the tunnel system and how much technology is required to actually have these tunnels, to maintain them, and to keep the water flowing. On this map, there's some interesting, surprising issues as well. We think that New York's water is pure, thanks to its rural origins and protected watersheds, but it's by no means untreated. These little dots that show in brown in chlorine, in green in fluoride, and then copper sulfide and caustic soda and phosphoric acid are added to the water all the way until until the water reaches the reservoirs in the Bronx and in Brooklyn. So there is a real cocktail of chemicals added to make New York water as pure as it seems to be. But what's remarkable is that it's still drinkable water. You can actually fill your glass and drink it. More things about how New York was organized. The traffic was, of course, a very major issue with millions of people and businesses going around. So New York City invented 3 kinds of arteries: highways, major roads, and minor roads. And this map shows basically all the major ones of those examples. It's not just the cars. Pedestrians also have important presence. Street lights govern traffic at 11,400 of the 40,000 intersections of the city. And they're all connected to one electronic area system that controls it. Kate Archer, I put her name here because I didn't want to forget her, because she does this unbelievable research of the technology of the city and the systems, and she has an army of researchers. I'm very impressed with her work. So the next fascinating item about New York is its subway system. New York subway system was built from 1900 to 1940 by 3 private companies. Therefore, there is all kinds of interesting intersections where levels don't meet and people in New York go up and down and around to reach their lines. But at the same time, it's one of the older subways. And this configuration on the left, the original 1940 configuration, shows that many parts of the Bronx, Queens, and Brooklyn were really not connected to the subway. So these people had to have other means to get to the city to work. The map on the upper right-hand side shows the current connection, which goes all the way down to the Jamaica Bay and further up. But still, it's a rather selective system, and it's not necessarily accessible to all the New Yorkers. But there's some very interesting facts about our New York City subway system. We have 842 miles of track. This is far enough to cover the distance between New York and Chicago. And some of our tracks are underground, 2/3 of them. And then some of them are at grade or elevated, and they still are working in the same way. But what's fascinating is that our New York subway system carries about 1.4 billion people, or it did before the pandemic. It's going up again, but now it's used by less people because of the pandemic. But in the same time, the Moscow system, which is much more, much smaller and simple, carries 3.2 billion people, or Tokyo carries 2.7 billion people, as you see the diagrams on the side. They're all concentric except New York City. And then the number of stations, though, maybe explains why the New Yorkers and Americans in general are getting fatter and fatter, because in Moscow, for 3.2 billion people, there are 165 stations. For 1.4 billion, we have 468 stations. So people work a lot less to go to the subway in New York, and perhaps would be healthier if they were walking a bit longer. Number of cars also, we have many more cars for the number of people that we carry in comparison to Moscow, even to Tokyo or London, so that the social distancing is a little bit easier. So it's clearly not the most beautiful subway system or cars, but it's probably the most spacious. And the hours of operation, the New York shines. It is 24-hour subway, and other cities have to shut their subways down. We have been shutting our subways for 5 hours in the beginning of the pandemic. Now it's down to 2 hours. So it's good. It's open, operates all day long, so night workers can also use it. All right, another subject, of course, is the rail freight. As you can see, New York region is very carefully planned so that the international long-range rail trade doesn't really cross Manhattan, but it has all these important stations up in the Bronx, Harlem River, Oak Point, or in Brooklyn or Queens, and it connects dozens of terminals with 3 major train lines: Canadian Pacific, CSX, and Norfolk Southern. These are the 3 major train freight companies that carry goods on the rails. This map shows the power plants in New York, but I think maybe the one that you will be most interested in is the steam tunnels. The map on the left shows the steam tunnels that serves buildings in New York. The first one, East River Station, is the oldest steam plant. It was built in 1901. It was powered by coal first, and then it was converted to oil, and then now to natural gas. But it actually produced heat and electricity for the city, and it was owned by Con Edison. Now we have a new one, downtown, which is on East River, and is carrying much of the steam power load. And a lot of the large buildings use the steam power, which saves them time and space in their buildings and continuously regulate their heat during the winter. The system now, of course, is in need of repair, but nevertheless, it's still working. So the power plants, of course, we have the Indian Point, which is up north in the Hudson River, and it's a nuclear power plant. It gives 20, actually the other sources say 25% of our power. And of course, there lies the problems, because we're in the process of decommissioning the Indian Point, but the ability for solar and wind energy to produce same amount of power is a real challenge for us right now. And the natural gas is another wonder that you may or may not know about. Our natural gas comes from 14,000 miles away from the Texas oil fields. And this very innocent little white dot that you see in the water marks the end of the 24-inch wide Tennessee natural gas line. At that point, the line goes down under the Hudson River and reaches the city. Now we should maybe talk about food and get a little bit closer to people. The Bronx Terminal, Gansevoort Market, Brooklyn Meat Market, so on, supplies the city with all kinds of protein and produce. But currently, much of this operation is moved to the area that looks kind of purple, if I don't know if you can see my cursor, to the Hunts Point. Hunts Point is the country's largest wholesale full market, and it's acres and acres large. And yet, with all this amazing availability of food and large distribution centers, many parts of the Bronx, Brooklyn and Queens, and Staten Island have no access to locally grown produce. So these black dots introduced to marketplaces. We have one in Manhattan that operates 3 days a week. Some of them are 2 or 1 day a week. But as you can see, the rest of New York City, Queens, and Brooklyn and Staten Island is a desert of local produce. After food comes garbage, I guess. Here is the sewer outflows all around East River and Hudson River around the Manhattan, as well as the Jamaica Bay and the upper parts of the estuary. So the sewer outflows used to go directly into the Hudson River and the surrounding rivers in the region. But we have been we good New Yorkers, high investors, and there's a lot of new sewer treatment plants. As you can see, the little marks on every of those locations show the areas where each sewage treatment plant serves. I mean, we're getting smarter as we get older. Here it is in the now the one that we built on 1986 on Hudson River, the North River Pollution Control Plant, not only controls treats the sewage, but it also has a skating ring, restaurants, swimming pools, and amphitheater on its roof. So it serves the New Yorker more than one function in a pretty clever way. The next thing is the piers. A lot of the piers that were part of the industrial New York waterfront are slowly being taken away. But these 3 piers around Pier 99, 98, and 99, 98, and 97 are basically used by Department of Sanitation. One of them is just for parking, the other one for barge parking. And then this shed that you see over there is used to sort trash and to load the barges. And I'm sorry to say, but we send most of our garbage to Pennsylvania. So next New York City phenomena is the mail. The city of New York has over 100 unique zip codes, as well as 44 buildings in Midtown. They have their own assigned zip codes because they're so large. But what I didn't know until I started to think about this lecture was the pneumatic tube systems. So there is a pneumatic tube system that connects Manhattan post offices and then directs it to international mail. And it works from 5 a.m. to 10 p.m., carries 400 to 500 pieces of mail within its 27 miles of two-way tubes at the speed of 30 miles an hour. I mean, it's not very fast, but it's probably much faster than having to deal with the Manhattan traffic. And also, I guess it's a reliable way to move mail around. With this, I will come to some of the issues that we face and we have faced for a long time. Actually, the word pathology came from my dear teacher, Richard Plans, when I was a student at Columbia University. We used to spend many hours trying to figure out how to connect these housing units to the street grid. So we must understand that infrastructure is not just about transportation, water systems, garbage disposal. It's also about education, human health, and welfare. Even though the public housing for the poor was originated in New York City, the socio-political environment around the issue to provide shelter for the poor and the working people resulted in the most discriminating formal expression, despite the thoughtful proportions of the 1811 New York City grid. The first public housing completed in 1941 that you see here in the Lower East Side was repeated over and over around different parts of the city and the country, which denies the inhabitants to the benefits of the street layout or even a street address. Once stepping over the edge of the sidewalk, everyone has to know that they belong to a different class, not worthy of the glamour of the city life and the benefits of the high-end residences surrounding these neighborhoods and lovely streets. Here is the pattern of how they develop it. They acquire the HRA and various public agencies. They acquire a number of blocks, demolish the houses, and then they put these cookie cutter buildings everywhere, creating islands of poverty within the city texture. And I think effects of this was most dramatically shown in the Robert Moses sponsored model designed by Lester Associates. All these red buildings on the right in the overall model shot at the Queens Museum shows the public housing. They stick like a sore thumb, doesn't have anything to do with the city grid system, and they look like this is where the poor lives. So we're getting close to the end. The New York metropolitan area today is what is the actual aerial photographs that you see on the left. And on the right, Eric Sanderson, who wrote the book Manhattan's Dream for 2409. I apologize. I never found out why 2409 was selected by him, but I'm sure he had a pretty good reason. Ecosystems, I have to read a quote to you from one of my dear colleagues, Jim Russell, who has come and lectured for us at NFIT. Very grateful to him. He wrote that ecosystems over time have often proved resilient to human use, capable of healing. But human actions no longer harm a forest here and there, or pollute the air only around the big cities. We're altering vast landscapes at a regional and continental scale. In too many places, people have gone too far. We have overstretched the resilience of too many biological systems on which we rely. This is part of a quotation from his book called Agile City. Jim was a reporter for Bloomberg News. And then during his time, he visited a lot of the places around the globe. And he wrote this book called Agile City that gives suggestions for the cities around the globe. But Eric Sanderson dreamed that our dense urban environment will get even denser along the waterfront once we stop the rising waters. And then most of the areas which are inferior housing would be left for farms and other ecological wetlands that will allow our region to heal. I mean, I am not sure how realistic this is. I probably won't be around in 2409 to see it, but it's probably a pretty ambitious dream. But you can see how he takes the Central Park and creates openings with the old rivers that connect to the East River. He opens the waterway down from Midtown down to the Hudson River. So he imagines a much happier world, much cleaner environment for 2409. But I think the questions that we face are much larger not just in the city, but in the region. This General Motors plant built along the Hudson on 1900 shows the amount of area they paved just to park their cars and produce cars. And now the site is ready to become a housing development. We hope that there will be some interesting measures to save this area and to eliminate all this paving. So here's another area that was with the rich resources of the Manhattan stones. The upper Manhattan has very good quarries for limestone. And this pit has been in operation since Thomas Edison. In fact, he invented the original crushing machinery for this pit. But right now it's mostly below water level and is ready to become a site of disaster. Then some optimistic things. Beacon Landing Brownfield was a train ferry, and it was purchased in 1996 by the Scenic Hudson, which is an ecological organization. They repurposed the whole area. They repurposed the factory and made a very famous Dia Art Museum. And the site is developed with environmentally sensitive shorefront amenities. So we know that it's very large, it's difficult, but it can be done. Well, what can actually be done? In the long term, incubating new ideas that build urban environmental resilience at the scale of transportation systems, metropolitan regions, coast and rivers, and the layers of ecosystem, systems that thread through our developed landscapes. A tall order indeed, as stated by my colleague Jim Russell. But what can we do in New York City? We can reduce new buildings' carbon footprint and their energy consumption per capita carbon emissions. We can increase climate change resilience. We can follow Plan New York City, which was developed during Bloomberg's time to actually regulate all the energy use in the city, or NYSERDA, which stands for New York State Energy Research and Development Authority, and other new regulatory guidelines to prevent further air pollution and environmental hazards. We can engage in more aggressive adaptive reuse policies. We can engage and commit to sharing information related to project design costs and performance to support decision-making processes, and exhibit architectural and urban design quality and innovation. That's us folks. Design every building based on its macro and micro content to bring context, to bring further awareness to the environment. And of course, the last one is engage in the awareness of our local ecology and bring back indigenous plantings and animals. In the next few slides, I have only 3 slides left. I'm going to show some of the projects I did in New York. And I apologize, there could be more slides, but I don't want to take more time. And I have been practicing since 1983, so I do have hundreds of projects. But here is one example in the historic Soho. This building, as you can see, is a typical Soho historic building. Already it's naturally very well situated. Upper floors have lower ceilings than the lower floors, so that they can, the lower areas with tall ceilings can catch more daylight. I highlighted the 5th floor because that's where the project that I worked on is located. As you can see in the microclimate and micro observations, if you live on the 5th floor versus the 2nd floor, there is a big difference about how much light you can get. And as you go higher, you get more lights. And in Soho, the developers created these buildings so the ceilings are lower, so you don't have to get overexposed to daylight also. So here is a project I worked on, which is a loft, 2 bedrooms. I created these volumes and ran the HVAC system along the top of the walls. So the hot air and cold air blows up. And actually cold air, hot air comes in the perimeter because that's the more sustainable way to do it. Radiators are in the perimeter of the building. And the top of these ducts are actually painted with reflective white paint. So what it does is that when you are in the summer, the noontime in the summer, you have the least amount of sun. And then, but early in the morning, these areas reflect sun to bring daylight where you can virtually work. In the equinox, it's also very generous. Now you can probably work with daylight in the entire loft without turning your lights. And at lunchtime, where the sun is high, reflections are high also, and it brings a lot of lights. But in the winter solstice, you see at 9 o'clock December, the light that comes all the way to the back wall. Or at noon, it still is quite present. And at this point, it's not just lighting, but heating effects of the sun are also at work. Here's another project. This is on West Broadway. And this loft is also on the 5th floor. That's over here. So the way we have known these people, they are good friends for a long time. So I was able to observe how far the sun could penetrate during the equinox. So at noon in the summer, the sun is pretty close to the front wall. And then in the spring and fall, it's further out. And in the winter, it comes in a bit further. Not as much as the way that I was able to reflect in the other loft. But here, since this is also a heavy timber building and the floors are very deep, I was able to install glass boxes in the floor and put some markers so that the residents can be aware of the seasons coming and going. That's it. So the last page is my bibliography. And I am proud to have a bibliography of real books. This is a message to my students. Now in New York, we are very rich with libraries. Avery, New York Public Library, Brooklyn Historic Society. But during the pandemic, we haven't had access to these places. So first of all, I'm grateful to my friends. Some of them are here for me, to lending me some of their books and the stuff that's behind me. So these references are all from real books and they are cross-checked. So I want to warn my students that when we do our studies these days, we have a lot of web links, but they're not always verified. So let's be careful and let's hope that we can get to our library soon. Thank you. Thank you for listening. I hope it wasn't too long.
Thank you very much, Beyhan Karahan. It was enlightening for us, I think. I announced the question and answer section, but now I want to recall again who want to make some questions or opinions about the presentation.
Maybe we can close to share seconds so that we see each other, and if anyone had a question, they can share. Çağba, what do you think?
Okay, but I'm not a co-host now.
All right.
Beyhan Hocam.
Beyhan Hocam, could you close the screen share so that, okay.
Sorry, I was still sharing. So.
Any questions are more than welcome.
I hope I didn't throw too much information at you.
May I just make a note rather than a question or a comment? Beyhan Hocam, the way you told about New York, basically, well, the region, the greater New York area, maybe, where the boroughs and everything, and the way you carried it all the way to today, including all kinds of systems that make it possible. That's the thing we usually take for granted. We don't really deal with how the post office works, for instance. The transportation and subway system may have some, we may remember thinking about it, but the way the garbage is processed, the way the water is treated, all the systems that make that organism work is very serious business. And when you, in a very short period of time, when you describe all of them one after the other, it really sort of shocks one, at least me, that it's a big operation, huge organism. And the thing that we see above ground when we walk around the streets, visiting the museums and going to cafes in village, or enjoying the Central Park, we just forget that there's this whole world underneath and around that makes it possible. That is very crucial, because when we talk about urban design or cities and neighborhoods and everything, we assume that all these services are provided somehow. But the way we realize, or once we realize that there's this huge investment, labor, and so on, that is part of it, that makes it work, is significant. I mean, it's a serious thing. We have to remember it at every moment. And the way you described your projects, the first one was your building, wasn't it?
Yes, it was another floor of my building.
Very familiar, yeah, another floor. But the way you told about your projects is related with the resources, natural resources, basically the sun. So that's not very common. So I just wanted to thank you with those notes, basically.
Thank you very much. I mean, I keep telling my students that if you can reduce consumption, you're already one step ahead, right? That's why I think we have to make maximum use of the sun and the climate and the winds. So I try to make good examples. But I mean, with New York City, this grand development is also very much connected to a lot of investment. For example, when the New York City waters were polluted, when the Collect Pond became a total a place for disease, the gentleman named Aaron Burr formed a company called Manhattan, and he went upstate and bought these estates to select these sites for the New York City water to stay clean and be supplied in a plentiful way. But of course, it's the same person, Aaron Burr, is the one who actually formed the JP Morgan Chase Bank. So it's connected to very large amounts of investment in almost every bit of this very detailed planning process.
Thank you, Beyhan, very much. I've been in New York City 50 years, and I thought I knew everything. And thanks for filling in the blanks. A great job, a lot of material. And Aaron Burr also killed one of our presidents. But,
oh, that's right.
So he's famous for a lot of things, right? But yeah, thank you again.
Thank you, Professor Rashan.
Merhaba, benim bir sorum olacak hocam. Teşekkürler öncelikle sunumunuz için. Sesim net geliyor mu?
Geliyor.
Bu 2409 öngörüsü için aslında bir şey ilgimi çekti. Genel olarak çok büyük metropollerde aslında biz kentleşmenin azalacağı ve artık doğanın da bir şekilde yer bulacağı yönde öngörülerde bulunuyoruz. Fakat buradaki insanlar aslında ne olacak? Ona dair çok da bir şey düşünmüyoruz gibi geliyor bana. Örneğin bu pandemi sürecinde metropol hayatında insanların büyük bir kısmı aslında sayfiye yerlerine, işte Ege'deki yerlere gittiler. Ve oraya da aslında metropol alışkanlıklarıyla beraber gittiler gibi geliyor bana. Ve bu metropolün aslında bir yerde sönümlenmeye başlayacağı. Çünkü uzaktan çalışmayla birlikte kentin o yoğun haline gerek kalmayacağını da öngörüyorlar bir yerde. Sizce acaba bu yeni bir kentli tanımına sebep olacak mı acaba? Bu kırsaldan kente göç ya da tersine göç bir şekilde dengelenecek mi? Yeni bir kentli tarifi acaba görecek miyiz zamanımızda?
So, dear Fatma, is it okay if I respond to you in English? Because I see that there's a lot of people who don't speak Turkish. Is that all right? Can I respond to your question in English?
Okay.
Yes, okay. I mean, I started to say that about the New York City housing, right? These kind of cookie cutter things, they're roughly 75 years old now. In the next 20 years, they will be 100 years old. And it's probably time to take these things down and do this thing more properly. It's probably time to take some of the old building stock, convert them into other uses, and then make the developments more dense in the cities. I think if there is a willingness, there will be a way to do it. How possible is it? Again, you know, that's why I showed the very famous diagram of Eric Sanderson. But actually, I think the things that I listed in my last slide is basically what we can do. I don't know if that answers your question.
Teşekkürler hocam. Evet.
People get used to their ways during the pandemic. They go and live in the suburbs. They go live in the beaches, and they bring their urban ways to these places. Yes, this is true. But I hope that also gives them a chance to enjoy how nice it is when the nature is close to them, and they can figure out how to bring it back to the cities.
May I bound another question that I have in my mind through this? You gave us a magnificent, a quite, how can I say? Again, you gave us a brilliant historical background about the city development, but you also had some points about the city's industrial past is not working as it is planned to work nowadays, especially with the pandemic. So, considering the question of Fatima's question also, should we say that do we have to plan a metropolitan city like New York City will be also how can I say, will be growing in the same rate coming towards the, for example, past 20 or 30 years, or the plans should be about this shrinkage of the city's population and the capital properties. I don't know if I'm
not sure if I quite get the question, but
I will try to make it more simple. I'm asking that cities will not be as polluted as it's planned, considering these pandemic situations, maybe. What do you think about that?
Well, cities, you know, when we had the beginning of the pandemic, I think there were all these very famous photographs, right, from Mumbai, where you could finally see the mountain that you never saw forever in your life. So the air got cleaner because there were very few people on the street. But we don't have to have very few people on the street. We can just have electric vehicles and subways and still have that same incredible purifying effect in the environment, right? And also, I think the new sustainable planning process also is very concerned about availability of food and its proximity to where people live. So, so creating places for growing food, creating green roofs where everybody can grow things, creating industries where people can work without commuting for many, many miles is very important. Also, I mean, one of my biggest hope is that in New York City, like anywhere else, we are in a very dire need of affordable housing. But we actually have the laws to make it possible. We have what we call a 20/80 rule. So anybody who has a serious housing development has to make 20% of their units affordable. And every developer tries their best to avoid this thing by just making one less unit, etc. But it exists. So it's possible when you take down the old housing stock to actually make mixed income projects that are larger scale, so that people aren't discriminated in any way, right? Both by being recognized as poor, and also giving the education to their children in these neighborhoods. I mean, we have situations even in the most enlightened neighborhoods in New York. If there is a public school next to a public housing project, some of the parents can still have the audacity to say, let's not include that address into our school district so that those poor children go somewhere else. So this is the kind of environment we live in. Laws are there and the willingness are there by some people, but we still have a lot to work on.
Thank you very much.
Something, and it's been a little while. I guess the last time I was there was 2 years ago, but over the last, I don't know, maybe 10 years, the Midtown has been, developing like crazy, right? And well, New York is the city of extremes, probably in many senses of the word, and especially the wealthiest and the poorest probably live together in very close distances. That's the other thing. But the high rises are the symbols of New York, but the new ones are outrageously high. I don't know what's going on now, and what is your take on it, and how is the new the current mayor addressing all these things that you have been talking about? The notes in your final slide are, of course, I mean, nobody wants to argue against that, but what's really going on?
Well, actually, I have some positive note about that. Actually, the same Kate Archer made an amazing research on high-rise buildings, which I couldn't include. There's just so much to talk about. But from what I understand is that the most efficient use of elevators is from 30 to 40 stories. Anything beyond 40 stories is not very efficient. But our very tall buildings only pretty much go to that height. So we're not in a situation like Dubai, Abu Dhabi, and those places where people are building 125 stories, right? Those are actually exceeding the cost of benefit. They end up being so slender residences for very few billionaires. But in New York City, we basically try to stay within that 30, 40 story height. And if that was done properly, it's probably the best way to increase the density. So we have daylight exposure rules, and these people, when they make skyscrapers, they have to absorb them, not to shade other places. So we have some regulation there that makes us hopeful. I think we can make denser environments if it's done responsibly. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but.
Well, at least there's, it's not a black and white situation, as I understand from your comments.
So many billions of people. If you have the sidewalks that are wide enough, if you have the streets that are flowing. So New York City, I think, is in a much better position than other parts of the world where this type of planning is left far beyond. And I think that's what the issue is. I think the transformation infrastructure is very, very important when you're dealing with tall buildings and extreme densities. So I mean, I think the governments or agencies will have to be the Aaron Burrs of the future, if that's possible, to make these huge investments so that you can actually have the kind of density we need to leave the nature to itself.
I think we don't have any other comments.
Çağda Türkçeyi de bir de Türkçe olarak anons eder misin? Yani
Tabii.
Türkçe soru sormak daha kolayına gidecek
Tabii
herkesin
ki.
belki.
Ee,
Dil meselesi de var. Tercümeyi sen yaparsın, biz yaparız.
Bir yandan
Beyhan Hoca
tabii.
kendisi.
Beyhan Hoca Türkçe olarak da sorularınızı alabilir.
Tabii efendim, Türkçe olarak ne yapmamı istiyorsunuz?
Yok, sizin için demedim.
Türkçe soru
Türkçe soru
size çevirebiliriz anlamında. Çağda izleyicilere bir duyuru yapıyor eğer Türkçe soru varsa.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry, of course. Memnuniyetle Türkçe konuşuyorum. Çok özledim. 1,5
Bizim genel halimiz İngilizce anlayıp Türkçe konuşamamak üzerinden olduğu için hocam. Türkçe sorularınızı da alabiliriz arkadaşlar.
Actually, I have a question about your mentioning the port situation in the New York. Actually, there's a really an export and import and all the financial issues and all the Manhattan things. Maybe it's up to this harbor or something like that. It's kind of a huge trade is going over here. And you are mentioning about the soil conditions of the Hudson River or something like that. If I am wrong, please just correct me. And you are saying that there are some limits about the ships or vehicles, the sea vehicles going through all the harbor or etc. There is, I hope I didn't know, I'm not informed about that, but there are some concepts that in the smart cities, in the smart harbors, and all these kind of trendy topics or something like that. What do you think about that? I think it's kind of the situation or the silhouette of all the New York and all the trading buildings and all the Manhattan silhouettes and etc. is also connected to the harbor and all the export and import things. So do you think that is kind of can be evaluated as an enhancement or something if they're directly imported the smart harbor concept into for New York?
Well, I mean, we have not had, New York Harbor is one of the oldest ones, right, of trade. We haven't had one of these Suez Canal situations here ever, but it's possible that if the barges become so deep that they can get stuck in the bottom. But also we have an Army Corps of Engineers regularly dredging the bottom of the harbor. That's another thing we do in New York. We dredge the harbor so that this does not happen. I think still the seafarer could be, if you have the solar and the wind power, seafarer could be one of the more sustainable ways to move goods around the world. So I'm all for ports, but I think what we heard from Suez, it tells us that we have to be very careful. We have to maintain these things.
Thank you very much.
You're very welcome. So I guess I thank you for that. And please contact me if you need anything from me. And I thank my friends to loan me their books and my friends to come and see me after many years. So I hope we'll see each other in person.
Beyhan Hocam,
if you have any plans
for your contribution.
Sorry.
Sorry, the two conversations got mixed up.
Yeah, I know. Go ahead, Banu, lütfen.
We were trying to thank you at the same time, I guess. I was saying thank you very much.
We were.
Thank you very much for your valuable contribution and your time and energy. It was really enlightening discussion, and we hope to host you again in the future events as well. Thank you, Beyhan Hoca.
Thank you very much. This type of talks actually help one synthesize everything you think about. So I'm grateful that I had to spend the last couple of weeks gathering all this information and then condensing it to the 45 minutes. But I thank you. I really enjoyed the process myself.
Thanks for the special efforts. I mean, that's very kind of you. Beyhan hocam, next time you're in Istanbul, we would like to have you with us.
Absolutely.
I don't know when it will be possible, but anyway.
Next time I'm in Istanbul, I would like you to have me.
Okay, then thank you very much, Beyhan Karahan, for meeting with us and all our participants. Some of them are too shy to ask anything. Then it's the end of our Mekan Konuşmaları. See you the next event, I think.
Okay.